Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Brancatella. I am the Deputy Director and Legislative Director here at NYAOT. Thank you so much for joining our Legislation at Lunch webinar today. If you've never been to a legislation at lunch before, I like to make these pretty quick. I don't want to waste your time. I like to get to the point. I save all questions until the end, but please do not hesitate to ask questions. Yeah, let's get in, get out. And today we are covering what's in the One House budget. So let's get to it. Or let's get to it if I could use technology. Okay, ooh, there we go. Okay, so the Senate and Assembly One House budgets came out last week on the 11th. The state budget, if you're not familiar with the state budget process, the state budget is technically due on April 1st. Is it going to be done by April 1st? Probably not. Yeah, it doesn't seem, I'm not gonna lie, compared to other years, this budget process has been pretty, there's nothing really to get riled up over. There's nothing really like extreme in there. So my hope is that we'll get it closer to April 1st than later, but either way, we will keep you guys updated. As you may be aware, our legislative priorities with relation to the budget are our big three: AIM, CHIPS, and SWAP. That stands for Sewer Water Action Program, Sewer Water Assistance Program. So those are our three main budget priorities, and there's some interesting stuff going on in here. With that, let's get started. AIM, in the executive budget, it had the base level grants flat, the same as last year. In addition, last year, there was $50 million in temporary municipal assistance that was included. I don't include this in AIM overall. It is technically a separate thing, but it is distributed pursuant to the same formula as AIM. So, sometimes it gets lumped in with AIM. So that's in the executive budget. The Senate has the exact same funding as the executive budget. However, they also have legislation found in PPGG Part PPP that creates an AIM redesign task force and appropriates $250,000 for this AIM redesign task force. This is something that NYAOT would support, the task force part of it, because you may be familiar that the AIM formula isn't really advantageous towards towns. Quick example, the town of Amherst has a population of about 130,000 people. The city of Albany has a population of about 90,000 people. The city of Albany receives about $13 million in AIM funding, whereas the town of Amherst receives about 600,000. So that is why NYAOT advocates for taking a look at the formula and seeing if we can come up with something that makes more sense. So that's in the Senate. And then the Assembly has the same base level grants at about $715 million. And then it adds an additional $50 million above what's in the executive budget and in the Senate for the temporary municipal assistance. We love the additional $50 million. So we are advocating for a combination of the Senate and the Assembly. Yeah, I mean, as you guys know, AIM should have been increased a long time ago, and we've lost money due to inflation. But yeah, that is what is in the One House, and combination of Senate and Assembly is what we would love to see in the final budget. Transportation funding, CHIPS, nice little chart. The only one that has advocated for or has included an increase in CHIPS is the Senate One House budget, and you can see here that they've increased it up to $723 million. So an increase of $125 million. They also have a $25 million increase in extreme winter recovery, $25 million additional in PAVE New York, $25 million additional in Bridge New York, and then some additional money for the Marchicelli program. The Assembly One House, not as great. They do have $200 million included for PAVE New York, which is above what's in the executive budget. But overall, the Senate One House budget has a lot more favorable transportation funding, and that is something that we will be advocating for. The Senate has always traditionally been pretty strong on transportation funding, and we met with Senator Cooney, who is the transportation chair, the Transportation Committee chair, and he is really great about understanding the need for CHIPS and increasing CHIPS-based grant compared to the other programs. While we love to see things like an increase in extreme winter recovery, the CHIPS program is really foundational, and that is reliable funding that you guys can plan for, and it's conducive to long-term capital planning. So above and beyond anything that's in like PAVE New York, POP, Extreme Winter Recovery, Bridge New York. Oh, which I actually have as Bridget New York. I'm going to fix that. That that's pretty funny. Yes, above and beyond those programs, which are kind of like ad hoc, they shouldn't really replace the CHIPS based funding. And that is, out of all the transportation funding, that's the thing that we advocate for the most, is an increase in CHIPS. So thank you, Senate. That is helpful. Our third budget priority, as I mentioned, was the SWAP program. That's a sewer and water assistance or action program. It would create a reliable, dedicated fund for sewer and water infrastructure. We are really excited because there is a proposal in the Senate One House budget that creates this program, and it appropriates $100 million for it. It is a start. There's also standalone legislation on this, sponsored by Senator Hinchy and Assemblywoman Kellis. So there's a few different routes that we could get the SWAP program to the finish line. Having it in the Senate One House budget is a great sign. I will say we have heard that the Assembly is a blocking point. They are, one of the arguments we have heard is that, oh, well, $100 million distributed among all of these local governments, how much is that actually going to do? What are they actually going to do with that? That's not enough to accomplish anything. Our argument is, and I'll actually go on to the next screen. All of the funding that is available for clean water infrastructure, water and sewer infrastructure, is grant-based, and that is not conducive to long-term capital planning. It creates a system where you have to react instead of being proactive and making preventative repairs. You have to wait for an emergency. So we really, and all three municipal associations are super into this. We really want to see the SWAP program. I encourage you, if you are so inclined, to reach out to your representatives and tell them how important a program like SWAP is. There is a sample letter and leave behind on NYAOT's website, and I will show you guys that at the end of this PowerPoint. But yeah, in particular, reaching out to the Assembly. We have a meeting, Chris and I have some meetings this week with various members of the Assembly to try and explain to them, this doesn't take over the grant-based program, the Clean Water Infrastructure Act funding. It is in addition to, we're not advocating to get rid of this funding, which is the Clean Water Infrastructure Act funding, where the executive budget proposes $500 million. The Senate proposes $600 million and adds an additional $100 million for lead pipe service line or lead service line replacement. The Assembly also adds an additional $100 million over what's in the executive budget, adds $100 million for lead service replacement lines, and requires that $15 million of this $600 million be dedicated for PFAS treatments in private wells, which is actually of interest to towns because a lot of times you end up taking over private wells or private systems and incorporating them into water districts. So yeah, we are keeping an eye on what sort of funding they're making available to private water sources. Again, this is all grant-based. It can be difficult for smaller municipalities to access. We've heard stories about how it can be difficult to access because you might not be considered a disadvantaged community. So anything that you can, any stories, any examples, if you want to contact me to let me know, those really help flesh out our arguments. Or again, contacting your representatives is really critical. We would love it if you could do that. Some other funding based things in the budget, in the three budgets: pro-housing community funding. All three budgets have it at about $100 million, have it at $100 million in infrastructure grants for those who are pro-housing community certified. And then the executive budget includes an additional $10.5 million for technical assistance. That would be things like revamping your comprehensive plan, adopting some new zoning codes, things like that. So great. Yeah, we're happy. We're good with this. Because it's in all three budgets, it's going to get done. There's not really anything that, I mean, I don't want to say it's definitely going to get done. I can't say definitely about anything, but if it's in all three budgets, it's a really good sign that something is getting done. DRI and New York Forward, those are the $10 million grants that are awarded each year to revitalize downtown areas or population centers in towns. That's under the New York Forward program. And under that program, I believe the grants are $4.5 million, not $10 million. But generally, it's just to revitalize downtown or population center areas. It's in the executive budget, the Senate and the Assembly at $100 million each for each program. So it's a pretty safe bet to say that this is going to be included in the final budget. EMS as essential service. So this is a biggie. This is a really big one. In the executive budget, it declares EMS an essential service. It mandates that municipalities ensure an adequate response capacity. And there were some amendments made in the 30-day amendments. It authorizes counties to form special ambulance districts. Before anybody freaks out about this provides authorization to counties pursuant to general municipal law, this new section of general municipal law. To be clear, it does not take away a town's authority to create an ambulance district under town law. So just because it gives counties the authority under general municipal law, it does not take away the authority that exists for towns under town law. So, okay, cool. The Senate proposal in the one house, it modifies the executive budget proposal to be consistent with this bill that was introduced last year as 4020C. And it's generally the same as what is in the executive budget proposal. There are a few differences. For example, the Senate proposal does not declare EMS a matter of state concern. That is actually a really big deal because the executive budget does declare it a matter of state concern. That is language to say we can preempt anything. That is like in the weeds, municipal home rule language. If something is a matter of state concern, then the state has the authority to preempt local governments on anything involving that area. So we do not want this to be declared a matter of state concern. Also, we do not want NYAOT does not want EMS to be an unfunded mandate. We are all for recognizing that EMS is in a critical, emergency state, no pun intended, right? It is in a very bad state. We need to do something about it. However, unfunded mandate, this would be a huge, huge, huge expense for smaller communities, and larger communities. So we are okay with giving counties the authority to create these ambulance districts and taking over that function if it is appropriate, if they create these districts. But yeah, we need some funding. Oh my gosh, pardon me. Hold on one second. We need some funding attached to this. So that is something that we are working on. And there's a really good comparison. And again, I'm going to show this at the end of the slideshow. There's a really good comparison of what's in the executive budget, what is in 4020C, and what is in the Senate one house bill on NYAOT's website. And it breaks it down really, really clearly. Dana did that for you guys, and she is amazing. And I think it's really well laid out. And then the Assembly has it intentionally omitted. That to me indicates that there is room for negotiation. It is a really big topic. I really think that the legislature wants to get something done sooner rather than later. But the Assembly not including it to me, again, is like a signal, room for negotiating. We have a lot of meetings set up on this. In an attempt to thwart institutional real estate investors from coming in and buying up a bunch of properties, like hedge funds, private equity funds, and basically contributing to the affordable housing crisis by creating all of these short-term rentals. The executive budget had a proposal that, oh my goodness, this is terrible timing for this. I'm so sorry. Hold on one second. Okay, the executive budget has a proposal that creates a 75-day waiting period before an institutional real estate investor can buy or submit an offer on a 1 or 2 family residence. The Senate modifies this proposal a little bit by clarifying that mortgage lenders are excluded. And the Assembly makes some interesting modifications. It increases 75 days to 90 days. It decreases the threshold. So an institutional real estate investor is somebody, it's basically somebody who's worth $50 million or more. The Assembly significantly decreases this, and it decreases the threshold for an institutional real estate investor from $50 million to $5 million. It expands the definition of an institutional real estate investor to include LLCs, and it imposes a 10% fee for institutional investors, half of which would be retained by the county and half of which would go to the Department of Taxation and Finance to support first-time home buyers and the housing and community renewal, the Division of Housing and Community Renewal, so the pro-housing community affordable housing initiatives that the state have. I don't know necessarily if we are going to take a position on one form over the other. It's not something that NYAOT is necessarily opposed to. It's something that needs to be done. You know, we have heard from a lot of our members about concerns about, you know, corporations, entities coming in and buying up properties and further exacerbating the affordable housing crisis. So yeah, we're good with this. Cybersecurity, there are 2 proposals involving cybersecurity under the executive budget. There's a proposal that would require municipalities to report cybersecurity incidents and ransomware demands within 72 hours to Homeland Security. The Assembly omits this, the Senate includes this. It's not something that we're opposed to. I'm not actually sure what the policy is behind the Assembly omitting it. I know that there are some standalone pieces of legislation that come out from time to time, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see something. I'm not gonna lie, I don't really have a good sense on where we are with this one. There are also proposals on cybersecurity training, and the executive budget would mandate annual cybersecurity awareness training for state and local government employees that use technology as a regular part of their duties. The good thing about this is that it is not an unfunded mandate. It actually, the state would provide the training. Or, for example, if you were a member of NYMER provides cybersecurity training, and you would be able to use that as to fulfill your requirement. So if the state is going to provide it and it's going to provide some flexibility, okay, yeah, not a problem. The Assembly intentionally omits this proposal, and then the Senate includes it, but it expands it even further to include additional requirements for the state that are not applicable to local government. So we're okay with it. We're nothing to panic about with this. All right. There are a few tax exemptions that were included. The affordable homebuyer tax exemption in the executive budget, local option. There would be a property tax exemption between 25 and 50%. It would only be on certain properties, like properties that are subject to a restrictive covenant or have some other form of legal obligation. It would be for qualified low-income households. And what I think of this is as the Habitat for Humanity exception, right? If Habitat for Humanity comes in and builds a house, and obviously there are a lot of restrictions and deeds in Habitat for Humanity houses, it would just say anybody who buys a Habitat for Humanity house. And again, there are a lot of qualifications. It's not like anybody can just come in off the street and buy a house from Habitat for Humanity. Those people who would buy that house would be qualified at local option for a 25 to 50% property tax exemption. The Senate increases the option of property tax exemption of up to 75%, and the Assembly omits it altogether. We're okay with it because it's at local option. And this is a really good example of working together and keeping relationships. Strange bedfellows are made in lobbying and in legislation. So we actually worked with the lobbyists for Habitat for Humanity on this. Originally, they had it as a mandate, and they were open to local option. So we were thrilled to have that included, the local option part included. So we are okay with that. Another local option, tax exemption, provides the executive budget has a local opt-in for, let's say that you have a property that needs to be rehabilitated, redeveloped. What this does is that if somebody demolishes a building, if somebody rehabs a piece of property, the amount of the increase in that property's worth would be considered tax exempt. I call it the fixer-upper exemption. The Senate includes it in the governor's, or the Senate includes the governor's proposal and the Assembly omits it. Again, because it's a local opt-in, we're okay. Some miscellaneous things, authorizing DASNY to work with local governments on planning, design, and procurement. That was in the executive budget. That is not included, is intentionally omitted in the Senate and Assembly budgets. That's not going to get in the final budget. No. Interest rate on judgments. I believe at the first legislation at lunch this year on the executive budget, I said I would bet the farm that these would not be included in the Senate and Assembly one houses, and indeed it is not. So not in there. That's not going to be included in the final budget. Again, I can't say anything for sure, but I would bet the farm on that one. There are some new proposals. The Assembly and the Senate both have the option to include new legislation that wasn't originally included in the executive budget. That's where the SWAP program comes from. So there are a few things that are particularly pertinent to local governments that I'm just going to go over. Usually, if it is in a one house, if it is new legislation that is only in a one house bill, the chances of it making it in the final budget aren't great, but it is a clear indicator that they are interested in it, and it might end up as standalone legislation, which is really where it could get done. So there are a few proposals, two of which are part of NYAOT's legislative priorities. The Senate has a proposal that would increase the salary restrictions for retirees who re-enter public service from $35,000 to $65,000. This is absolutely something that we support. It's part of a workforce development initiative. And yeah, absolutely support this, 100%. I mentioned this already, the Senate SWAP program, and there's also standalone legislation on that. Absolutely support that. One thing that we are concerned about that was in the Senate one house is there is an expansion of prevailing wage. And we are particularly concerned about this because it's generally consistent with some standalone legislation that the Assembly also sponsors. So this would expand prevailing wage to construction projects that are funded, that have at least 20% public funding, and the total public funds expended on it is $5 million or more. Currently, the law says that prevailing wage applies to projects that have at least 30% public funding and costs over $5 million, or so this would lower from 30% to 20%. As I mentioned, there is a standalone piece of legislation that is sponsored in the Assembly. It is A 6708, and this we would have 20% of public funding or $3 million in direct payment of money, or total public funds of $5 million or more. Prevailing wage really increases the cost of projects. We have signed on to a letter along with the Association of General Contractors and a myriad of other groups opposing this, raising some concerns. This was also introduced last year, and we were able to beat it back. So hopefully we will be able to do a similar thing this year. But yeah, we are definitely keeping an eye on this one. Yeah. Some more new legislation. Senate also has a proposal of a local option for 100% property tax exemption for veterans that have a 100% service-connected disability. There's a proposal to allow municipalities that are purchasing electric buses that operate a public transportation system to not have to comply with competitive bidding, basically. There's also a proposal on brownfields and PFOAs in Senate TED Part 000. It expands what sort of projects are what's considered a contaminant to include forever chemicals like PFAS. municipalities would not be eligible for restoration funding if they basically contributed to PFAS in the water through gross negligence or intentional misconduct. That's a really high standard. So it wouldn't be like, oh, it wouldn't be, gross negligence is a higher standard than regular negligence. It's like you would have to do something really, really bad and like intentionally do something wrong. But if this does create an exclusion that says that municipalities would not be eligible for restoration funding. It would require municipalities to help the state identify those who are responsible for polluting through providing property tax records and other local records. It prioritizes restoration projects in brownfields, and states that complete the state approved remediation would be indemnified against lawsuits related to contamination. So you wouldn't have to actually provide your own defense. The Attorney General's office would provide that defense. So we're okay with that. With that, I'm actually going to see if there are any questions, and I'm going to see if I can close out of this because I do want to show you guys where stuff is located on our website. Is that it? No. Okay. Okay. So on the NYAOT website, there is information available on the state budget. If you go under, it's on the homepage. If you go under legislation and advocacy and you see NYAOT NYS budget analysis, we have things like a full review of the one house bills and the analysis and summary. Here is the comparison document that I was talking about with the difference in the EMS bills between the standalone legislation, the Senate one house, and the executive budget. Yeah, I think we are moving. When I talked about how we have some sample letters and leave behinds, that's currently on the members only section of the website, but I think that we are going to expand that and move that over to the homepage so it's easier to access. But yeah, that is what's pretty much, that's a quick overview of what's in the one house budgets. If anybody has any questions, I am here to answer them. But of course, you can ask me that anytime. My email is sbrancatella, S as in Sarah, BRANCATELLA, at nytowns.org. Or if you just go to nytowns.org, my email is listed on the website. So yeah, that's what I have for the Senate. Okay. Can you share the URL for finding the information you've presented? Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'll send out a copy of, or we'll have a copy of a PDF of these slides sent out. So I can send a copy of how to find these bills. I will say it's thousands and thousands and thousands. Oh, the live URL I just talked about. Okay, yeah, it's nytowns.org. So yeah, just the main page of our website, nytowns.org, right up there. And then on the homepage, it's legislation and advocacy. Budget, yep. All right. I don't see any other questions. So I hope this was informative. We will have another webinar when the final budget comes out, and be sure to check out we have a podcast started that covers a lot of things that are going on in legislation. If you are not signed up, there is a weekly legislative email that goes out while we are in session that provides updates. That goes out on Friday afternoon, sometimes Friday evening. But if you don't get that and you want to be on that distribution list, let me know, send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for attending.